welcome to Crafting at CCPL. Today we are going to make a quilted potholder. I'm going to show you several different types of quilts. This is one that's on my bed. It is a 9-patch quilt, and you can see because it does form 9 squares. Here would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And then it's put in a grouping of 4. This is known as a bear claw pattern or maple leaf, and this one in particular is called the maple leaf because it has a stem. Without the stem like this, it's called a bear claw. And this is on a king-size bed, so it was like quilting a tent. But there you get the picture, but there you get the general idea of what it looks like. And this is a quilt that my mother made. Now this is an applique form. Now she has a Bernina sewing machine. Let me turn the light on here. She has a Bernina sewing machine. So the sewing machine actually does all of this, and then it was applied to the quilt. So each panel is a different doily pattern. This is a quilt that my grandmother made. It's not a typical quilt in that it doesn't have batting. It's not done as patches. It's done completely by hand. It's called a Cathedral Window, and I'll show you what the back looks like. The back is composed of little squares that are sewn together, and then you sew these little inserts in. It's done by folding fabric, and then you sew these tiny stitches here which frame it. So this is called a Cathedral Window. And then there's this quilt, which is not really, it's almost an imitation of a 9-block pattern, as you can see. But these are not individual blocks. There are like a triangle, and then there's a square, and then this was a square sewn on top of this. This was done by my great-grandmother, and it's made from my grandmother's clothes when she was a little girl. So it's interesting to see some of the patterns that are here. A lot of it is, actually there's a hole because this is almost 100 years old. Actually it is 100 years old, so that's why it looks the way it does. But you can see some of the patterns that they were wearing. But you can see some of the patterns that she was wearing, which would have been in the 19-teens. And then they backed it with like a mattress ticking. It does have batting between the layers, but there's no actual quilting. It's actually just tufted. And when I say tufted, it's just gathered, and they put this little, like a knot through it to tie the batting in the front and the back together. So you can see all the little tufts that are on it. Now since I'm upstairs filming some quilting, I thought I would show you a sweater. This has nothing to do with quilting whatsoever, but if you've been following these crafting series the last few weeks, I did a series on knitting, and so this is a sweater I just finished. And yes, the gathers right here in the center are supposed to be there. It just has like a little gathered section right in the center. But here it is, it's blocking, so it's been wetted, and then you stretch it out and hold it down with blocking wires and pins. And the purpose of this is to stretch it back into shape so the edges don't curl, and sometimes it just gets twisted based on your tension as you're knitting it. So I thought I would just kind of throw this in since I was up here and it was sitting here. Now, materials you will need to make this pot holder: you will need 2 pieces of contrasting material because our quilt is going to be in 2 colors. If we were making it in 3 colors, you would of course need 3 pieces of material. But you only are going to need 2, and you don't need much of them. You're just going to need roughly a 6.5 inch by 6.5 inch piece of each of your materials. And like I said, you probably will have some left over. You'll also need to have a 6.5 by 6.5 piece of material for the back of the pot holder. So remember, this is going to be the top. We are not going to be quilting, piecing a quilt on the back of the pot holder, so it will be solid. Now, in my case, I have enough of the solid material that I will just use some of this for my back as well. And then lastly, you will need something to put in between the layers, between the top of the quilt and the bottom of it, to act as the cushion, which is what creates the quilt when it's stitched together. And if you are making this as a pot holder, you want something that's going to be thick enough that you're not going to have any heat transfer come through. So things I would recommend that you might have right around the house would be an old towel. I would recommend cutting the towel and doubling it, but cut it to a 6 inch by 6 inch piece for your interior, the batting section. You can also use batting. You can use polyfill, like with what stuffed animals are made with. You could use that as well. You can use like pieces of an old blanket, anything that's going to be thick enough, and you're going to cut that batting to 6 inches by 6 inches. So let's get started with what you will need as far as cutting your top part of your pot holder. Now, I could pin my template to my material and then cut around it, or I could lay my template down and use a pen and mark it like this, and then just go back and cut it. So whichever method works for you is the one that you can use. So let's do this part together. We will cut 4 of the blue and 4 of the pattern triangles. So we'll do that portion first. So there is our actual quilt, so here's our actual pot holder laid out how we're going to put it together. This particular style is called a nine patch, because as you can see, it's composed of 9 squares. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. So we're going to actually sew these pieces together as far as these corner pieces first, so that we are actually working with squares themselves. So you are going to allow a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and we're going to go over to the sewing machine, or if you don't have a sewing machine, you can sew by hand, but you are going to lay the pieces right sides facing in like this, and you're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance straight across here. And of course, these solid pieces we don't need to do anything to, so we are just going to be dealing with these 4 corners. So let's go over to the sewing machine and do it together. I now have all of my triangles sewn into squares. Now you will notice when you look at your sewn together piece here that it is smaller than the solid piece, but remember, this has had a seam go through it at this point. By the time these get their seams attached, they will match the right size. So don't let that throw you a little bit. Now you're going to use this diagram to match your parts together. So here is this particular part would be this square right here. So we know next to it we are going to have a solid color. So we're going to pin like sides together from point to point, and we're going to sew that. When we finish that section, we know that we are going to use a triangle and sew it to the other side facing this direction, just like how it is in the pattern. So let's sew this strip across here together. I now have that first section done. You can see that my bottom row here matches this row here. So you're going to continue the same thing with the next 3 rows. So you will have 3 separate strips when you're finished. So I'll let you pause the video and then come back when you have the other 2 strips done. I now have my 3 pieces. I have my top, the middle, and the bottom. Now I'm going to take the top part here and I'm going to flip it over so the right sides are facing, and I'm going to sew across here. But if you want to use pins, this would be the time to do it, because you do want to make sure that your seams stay exactly lined up. So if you want to put a pin here and a pin here to make sure they stay in the right place, you could do that. So here's my first portion here sewn together, and now I'm going to take the bottom piece and I'm going to flip it over the middle, again with the right sides facing. I'm going to pin it in place and I'm going to sew it together. I now have a completed top to my pot holder. It's all completely sewn together, and you can iron this so it stays nice and flat, so that when we come back the next time and sew our back on and the batting and the quilting, you'll be ready to go. So that is it for this week. Again, please come back next week so we can finish our pot holder together. Thanks for watching.